Hello. Digital transformation is one of the hot topics today, and retail is certainly a hot topic because we all spend a lot of time in stores. And on this episode of CXO Talk, episode 105, we're talking with someone from Kroger, one of the largest retail organizations in the universe. I'm Michael Krigsman, and I'm here with my, I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it with my brilliant co-host, Vala Afshar. Hey, Vala.
Wow, what a great compliment.
It's
another fantastic way to end a Friday afternoon, having an incredible digital thought leader, Shashank, on the show with us, and then now this compliment. So this is turning out to be a great show already.
What a great way to end the week.
Absolutely. No better way.
All right. So we're here with Shashank Saxena. And Shashank, you work for Kroger. Welcome to episode number 105 of CXO Talk.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Vala, for having me on the show. It's a delight to be here.
Shashank, what is your title and what do you do for Kroger?
So I'm currently the director for digital and e-commerce technology at Kroger. So all the teams that write the web apps, mobile apps, tablet apps, e-commerce applications, they all report up through me. I've been in this role at Kroger around 2 years or so, and before this I have a background with Citi. So it's been an exciting journey here at Kroger.
Can you tell us a little bit about Kroger, the size, scope, and so our audience can get a full appreciation of the size of your company?
Sure. So Kroger is one of the largest retailers in the U.S. We ended this year, I believe, at $108 billion in terms of revenue. So we are a Fortune 25 company. We are known under different brand names in different parts of the country. So if you go to the West Coast and you go to Southern California, you may know Ralph's. Ralph's is actually part of the Kroger company. King Soopers out in Denver, that's part of Kroger. You go up to the Pacific Northwest and you'll see Fred Meyer or QFC Foods. They're part of Kroger. So we're known under different names in different parts of the country. So Kroger is actually pretty big in terms of size and operation. We have big manufacturing plants, I think right under 40 manufacturing plants. We have a strong pharmacy business, and of course traditional grocery retailing and food and perishables is one of our strong suits. So Kroger is, I think, 130 years old in terms of when the company was formed, and it's been growing ever since. We operate 2,600 or so supermarkets, along with gas stations, convenience stores, jewelry stores. So you'll see Fred Meyer Jewelers and Lippman Jewelers. They are all actually owned by Kroger. Tom Thumb, in terms of the gas station chain and fuel chain, that's actually part of the Kroger company. So it's a very well-diversified company in the retail sector, which with multiple formats and multiple geographies in this country.
So people don't realize that beyond the Kroger brand, that you're almost as large. You're like number 2 behind Walmart, right?
That's true. Yep.
That's amazing.
So you're just an extraordinarily large organization, and so how does your role interact with the retail parts of Kroger? So what exactly? I guess let me ask it this way: what exactly do you do?
So traditionally, Kroger has been a brick and mortar retailer. We've played around in the online space a little. So we've had jewelry ordering online for the last few years. Now with the whole emergence of omni-channel and digital commerce, we are starting to get a little more involved in terms of how we interact with our customer, what we allow the customer to order online, and the experiences we build for our customer. So that's my role for Kroger in terms of taking a traditional brick and mortar retailer and starting to provide and build out the omni-channel experience. It's been 2 years that we've been on this journey. Right now we are very heavily focused in terms of digital coupons. So we've just completed over 1.5 billion coupons download recently. And we went public with the announcement that we've merged with UTech, which is a digital coupons company out in Silicon Valley, U Technologies. So we're actually growing our digital presence within Kroger and how we connect with our customer and serve our customer digitally.
So Shashank, let's shift the focus, and thank you for the background and the incredible profile of Kroger. But we're talking about digital business transformation, and You gave us a hint of some aspects of that when you talked about digital coupons. But the term is pervasive, not just in retail, but certainly all business is digital business or dead business, in my view. But why don't we talk a little bit about the dynamics and how they've changed in the retail space? Maybe some would argue from the introduction of the iPhone in 2007 to all of the other technology trends of mobile and social and cloud and data and so on and so forth. How does this impact retail?
So overall in retail, right, I think it's broader than just digital and what digital is doing in terms of transformation. Digital is one of the key pieces, but from a consumer standpoint, as we've seen the economy bounce back and we have a decent economy going right now, customers are not just looking for the lowest price point. What they're looking for is the best value, which a lot of times may or may not be the same thing. We've seen the rise of the value-based shopper, and what we try to do is provide value to our customers. Another industry trend that we're starting to see is health and wellness. So our Simple Truth organic brand, we launched the private label brand in-house. 18 months into launch, it became a billion-dollar brand and it crossed $1 billion in revenue. So the whole rise of health and wellness, not just in terms of active lifestyle and how people choose to live, but also how they choose to track their health, how they choose to maintain the healthy shopping, the healthy habits that people are making and choices that they're making is reflecting in their shopping behavior in the store. With the wearables technology, Fitbit bands, and now the Apple Watch is about to come out soon, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But health and wellness is another big macroeconomic trend that we are seeing that's impacting retail. The rise of the millennial shopper is another trend that we are seeing that's impacting retail, because we're at this point right now where we have multiple generations shopping retail stores at the same time. And a lot of retailers, where they get hung up is they're trying to be everything for everyone. And that is always harder to do as compared to focusing on one narrower demographic. So to summarize what I just said, right, digital, the rise of the value shopper, the rise of millennials, and the boom in health and wellness are macroeconomic trends that are starting to shape digital transformation in retail.
So you are at the mercy, in a sense, of the expectations of consumers and these broader macroeconomic trends. And so how do you translate, how do you discern what those expectations are, and then how do you translate those expectations into activities that Kroger must undertake in order to meet what those consumers want from you?
So in terms of understanding the customer need, right, we are very, very focused in terms of what our customers are asking for. But if you start looking at what do you want to build from an innovation standpoint, is very different from just catering to a customer need. Because if a customer is asking for a certain feature and you deliver on that feature, I don't necessarily think that can be categorized as innovation as much as it is just customer service, where someone asks for something and you're going ahead and serving up that feature. And innovation is pretty different in my opinion, right? So when you talk about innovation and digital transformation, generally it can happen in one of two ways. Either you go ahead and innovate through evolution, which is step features and functions, or through revolution. And we've seen the industry go ahead and do both. There are multiple examples out there. So, Vala, you mentioned about the iPhone and the launch of the iPhone. That I would categorize as a revolutionary innovation, because it changed the whole ecosystem around us, where today someone sitting in a garage or in their mom's basement can go ahead and write an app and reach out to millions and millions of customers worldwide. And the reach to millions of people was a luxury of Fortune 500 companies, not necessarily small mom and pop shops or someone in their garage. So that has changed the trend, right? And that's why I call that revolutionary innovation. Whereas if you look at small step feature function enhancements, they are evolutionary innovations. So the example I give is right down the street is P&G, Procter & Gamble. And if you look at Tide, Tide has dominated the laundry market for a really long time. And what P&G did with Tide and Tide Pods to come up with the same category but create a new subcategory under the category, I call that evolutionary innovation, because they didn't change the way you do laundry altogether, but they simplified the process by giving you the ready pods. So that's how I categorize this in terms of revolutionary versus evolutionary innovation. We are very focused on our customer, and customer feedback is a great thing. And we try to incorporate that, but we again keep the distinction very clear in terms of when are we trying to be revolutionary versus evolutionary.
Yeah, how do you make that distinction? I mean, for an innovative company like Kroger and leaders like yourself, as you're developing your, let's say, technology investment thesis for the next 1 to 2 years, and I'm not sure you can go beyond that given the pace of innovation, but assume it's a forward-looking roadmap. What are some of is it customer feedback? Is it your internal entrepreneur and think tank organization that decides you're going to make a bet on something that might be revolutionary versus evolutionary? And how much does the company culture dictate which approach you're willing to take in order to deliver the best value to your end customers?
So this is a little bit much bigger and broader than just Kroger and how Kroger thinks about this, right? If you look at these examples that I'm giving, none of these were Kroger specific.
Sure.
But when you think about revolutionary and evolutionary and what and who determines that, for revolutionary innovations, customer feedback has always been a misleading feature. And the reason I say that, right, I'm going to quote 3 or 4 different examples. When customer surveys were created, where would you allow someone to come and stay in your house and rent out a room to a stranger for a night with your family? The feedback on that was absolutely negative. They said, no way in hell am I going to allow a stranger to come and stay. Yeah. Well, Airbnb taught us that that was absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
The same thing with allowing a stranger to ride in your car. You have no clue if that person is a serial killer or not. And this was actually the same time when the Craigslist incidents were hot, right? Where it actually happened in Boston, I believe. But apparently that was wrong too. A lot of people ride in cars with strangers today, and Uber's valuation is $40 billion, whereas Kroger's market capitalization today is $36 billion. Now we can argue whether it's a bubble and the valuations are overvalued or not,
Sure.
But the fact is Uber has done well. And customer feedback was a misguiding feature or a misguiding data point along that. Actually, Steve Wozniak was in Ohio a few weeks ago, and I got to attend this closed group session with him. And the other data point that was interesting, what he mentioned, was when they were first thinking about creating the Apple II. Apple I was actually property of public domain because that was before Steve Jobs got his head around proprietary IP. So when they asked about Apple II and creating the personal computer, everyone they had surveyed, and this was actually IBM that was surveying, IBM used to sell big machines and computers to big corporations. So when they asked big corporations and buying agents in big corporations, do you think there is a demand for this product? The answer they got unanimously across the board was hell no. But what they missed out was they didn't go out and ask doctor offices, lawyer offices, smaller business shops who could not afford those big computers around, hey, are you interested in buying this product? So that's another example where customer feedback has gone wrong. So if you see in these examples, they are varying in time right from the 70s till all the way up to 2010 and later. And very consistently, when you talk about revolutionary innovation, customer feedback has actually been a misguiding feature rather than a pointer to you to lead you in the right direction, right? Same thing with Google. I mean, overwhelmingly, the feedback was the world does not need a 5th search engine. And boy, have they been proven wrong or not.
Absolutely.
So Shashank, but still, at the same time, you have to listen to your customers. I mean, obviously, for example, in your case, you're making a variety of forecasts about where the future is going and what are the implications of that for the digital presence and the digital relationship that a retailer has with the customers. So you've got to place bets somehow. And so how do you make those decisions? I'm following up on Vala's point. How do you make those decisions about where to place the bets?
So that works really great in terms of evolutionary step feature innovations. Customer feedback is a very, very critical driving point in terms of what goes out in the next release on the product roadmap. And that's not just Kroger, but that's across the board in the industry, where good product managers listen to customer feedback and incorporate feedback to evolve the product in the next release. So we are no different. We do it the same way, where we are very, very obsessed with what the customer says and what the customer thinks, and we evolve our products in that way. So one of the things that, and this example is actually 2 years old, but when Passbook first launched, internally, again, my personal opinion was I don't need my loyalty card stored in the passbook because I already have it stored in my app. Now, customer feedback told us the otherwise, where people were asking for it. And the minute we launched it, the adoption numbers were huge. So we've seen our app download numbers increase because we listen to customer feedback and incorporate that in the product roadmap. So that is absolutely true in terms of evolutionary innovation. So that's why I wanted to make the distinction really clear between evolutionary versus revolutionary.
So it seems like a healthy balance, maintaining a beginner's mindset, even if you're introducing revolutionary concept, always have that feedback loop where you can enhance and incrementally bring innovation and value to your customers.
Absolutely. And then the other thing, so customer feedback is absolutely critical. It is the center of everything we do, and it should be that way. Now, over and above that, you also need to start factoring in macroeconomic trends, right? Not just the overall trends impacting retail, but the trends that impact digital in particular. So for example, we've seen the explosion of data, the emergence of platforms, the rise of mobility, and how do you start using these in a very focused way to add value to the life of your customer? So even in terms of explosion of data, from when you've woken up this morning up to when this Hangout started, there has been more data uploaded on YouTube than the entire content Hollywood has produced in the 100+ years of its existence.
Wow. Can you repeat that one more time? So since the Hangout started
this morning,
yeah,
up till now, up to when this Google Hangout session began, there has been more content uploaded on YouTube than content Hollywood has produced in 100+ years of its entire existence.
That's amazing.
So understanding that trend and what's going on with data explosion is really, really critical, right? And no customer feedback is going to go ahead and explain that trend to you. You sort of have to understand and build that. Now, you have to incorporate customer feedback in terms of user experience and how these things evolve. But you need to understand the macroeconomic trends as well. Same thing with emergence of platforms, right? If you think about 10 years ago, if you were a game developer, the best career options for you was getting a job at Sega or Nintendo or Atari or one of the EA Sports, one of those game developers. But today, if you look at the trend, or even last few years, you can use a platform like Facebook to launch a game like Farmville, Cityville, Mafia Wars. Zynga IPO'd based on that. So how do you use platforms to go ahead and change the distribution paradigm due to digital? So digital is actually transforming a lot of businesses, right? Same thing with Candy Crush and what we are seeing today, where Kings is IPO'd as well. So that paradigm is shifting because of the platforms and the reach and distribution channels that these platforms have created for small businesses and mom and pop shops and even kids sitting in their mom's garage or basement and writing apps, because the whole platform distribution mechanism has changed.
Makes sense.
So what about the role of business models in all of this? So as you're thinking about these different types of innovations and you're looking at the macroeconomic trends and you're thinking about what consumers are going to be wanting, how does the notion of a business model fit into play? Weave that in for us.
So whoever has the answer to that, that's actually $1 million question, because no one has really figured it out. A lot of the innovations these days, 10 years ago, what we were seeing were just hardcore, deep down tech innovations, right? Kind of stuff Google was working on in terms of tweaking algorithms and tech innovations. But in the recent past, in the last 5 years or so, what we are starting to see is business model innovations. So if you look at Airbnb and Uber, they're not hardcore tech innovations because the technology powering that is pretty simple for the most part. But what's innovative there is actually the business model and how it's funded with low infrastructure costs, low startup costs, and crowdsourcing economies. So that has become the transformational piece of it. We think about business model innovations pretty often, and we are starting to see that emerge more and more. But we also think about in terms of how do we personalize our offerings, because personalization is a key differentiator. I don't know if you remember the movie, but there was this movie called When Harry Met Sally.
Yeah.
And there was this scene where she goes ahead and orders her coffee on the plane, and she wanted black coffee with exactly 2 spoons of sugar, with no milk, she gave the whole list, right? And the screenplay writers and directors use that as a metaphor for character development to show that, hey, this person is opinionated, she has an opinion, she wants her coffee a certain way. Whereas and that time it was tried to maintain that this is a high maintenance person, right? At least that's the character that they were trying to portray. Today, we call that same theme personalization, right? Starbucks has made a great business model out of, I want my coffee my way, and I want it to be consistent no matter which Starbucks location I hit. And that personalization versus being high maintenance is the difference in terms of customer expectation a few years ago versus today.
Well, mass customization.
Exactly, yeah. So that's another emerging trend that we are seeing, and business models will evolve as they start understanding customer preferences, or rather the change in customer preferences.
So one can argue like Uber is a data company, big data company, not a transportation company. And if you're going to deliver customization, you have to have a segmentation strategy. You have to be able to analyze customer behavior and data. You have to respond in real time. There's just tremendous amount of, not only talent but technology and process transformation in order for you to deliver value to the right person at the right time, at the right location, across the right channel. So my question to you, in marketing, I think data scientist is a role that's going to emerge as one of the perhaps most important future hire or hire today. Where do you see, in terms of talent, whether it's the digital group or the marketing or IT, what are some of the skills required to successfully, evolve as an organization and as a business?
No, actually, you were bang on accurate, right? So I think data is really critical, and the role of the data scientist, data analyst, data engineer, and all these profiles is going to become critical. One tech trend that we are seeing is the move from structured data to unstructured data. A lot of companies have built tremendous competence and even products around how do you deal with structured data, how do you deal with relational databases and data tables and structures that we've learned how to mine over the course of years, and we've built excellent competency around. But the move towards unstructured data is sort of almost changing the paradigm in the industry here, because what you can start doing with unstructured real-time data, I don't even think we've seen the tip of the iceberg yet on that one. So as you said, I totally agree with you in terms of those roles and how they evolve in the industry.
So tell us about your team. Tell us about your team, and tell us how your team relates to some of these larger trends. I don't know if you're comfortable talking about that specifically, and if not, talk to us about some of the things that are going on with grocery retailing, like with Google and with Amazon, for example.
So we look at competitors, but we don't obsess over competitors because we're just so obsessed with our customer, right? So we focus on customer needs and what our customer is asking for. Overall, from my team standpoint, right, one of the things you'll start seeing and hearing about, and I've actually heard this example at least 200 times since I've been at Kroger, which is why I'm going to share this, is, hey, Shashank, wouldn't it be cool if Kroger actually started doing push notifications where you walk past the shelf of Tide and it pushes an alert saying $1 off Tide? Well, that's really great, but launching that feature has a lot of other downstream implications. How do you know, when does that feature become old? When a customer has walked past 10 shelves and you bombarded them with 100 different messages. And there are multiple apps that are doing that. So I'm just actually trying to close the gap between your question and the way we think. I have apps on my phone today where when I've loaded them on my phone, and when I'm driving to any location, I pass a CVS, I pass a Walgreens, I pass a Safeway, I pass a Target, and it keeps bombarding me with push notifications saying, walk into the store right now, get so much off. And driving customer value is very, very different from bombarding them with features. It's only a matter of time before the customers will be turned off and put off. So our value prop is pretty different, right? We incentivize customers for things they buy often and usual, not necessarily trying to cross-sell and upsell the customer. We have this really successful program called the LCM mailers that we send out to customers, which are actually coupons. So the goal is, if the customer buys Huggies diapers, we go ahead and send them coupons for Huggies diapers. We don't try to get them to switch a brand or change that or have CPG marketing dollars influence and change buying behavior. We are so focused on what our customers want and what they buy often that we just want to go ahead and help them buy more of that or get what they want, not necessarily help them brand switch or try to monetize on top of that. That's one thing I believe Kroger does really, really well, and we believe in the customer, which is why when you ask about competitors, we sort of keep track of what competitors are doing, but we're not obsessed with our competitors because we're very obsessed with our customer.
Sure. So Shashank, let's take an example where Michael Krigsman's going to walk into one of your stores. Michael has got 25,000 followers on Twitter. He's got a clout score that's in the 70s. So when Michael says he enjoys his experience at one of your establishments, his word of mouth and his scale and his network is enormous. And you've got this concept of showrooming that is potentially hurting retailers where you go on premise and you price check something on the web and you decide to buy it on the web. Now, how do retailers look at social influence and folks that can come on premise and how you can leverage their word of mouth and perhaps incent them to become advocates by maybe in a sort of just generic push notification, since you can identify Michael and be able to understand his digital footprint, perhaps give him a custom coupon or rebate and ask him to share that amongst his network as part of a loyalty program. Other ways to use mobile and social and app technology to mitigate the impact of showrooming and at the same time build word-of-mouth marketing. Is that something that's on retailers' radar, or are there folks that are doing it?
Overall, in terms of retail, that's actually a really big problem when you look at categories like electronics and some of the other higher categories. Thankfully, predominantly, a large portion of our business has been grocery retail, and showrooming hasn't really taken off in terms of grocery retail. Also, e-commerce hasn't taken off to a large extent in terms of grocery retail. Now, we're doing e-commerce in terms of you order online and you pick up in-store. Harris Teeter, whom we merged with a year and a half ago, I believe, has a really, really successful program around order online and pick up in store. We call that Harris Teeter Express Lane. That allows the customer the convenience to go ahead and order online. But overall, in the grocery segment, showrooming has not been a very dominant problem. Now, the other piece that you touched, right, in terms of the customer being a connected customer, and today the customer being a lot more informed in terms of what they are doing. We support that behavior, and we start driving analytics and insights around customer behavior and customer purchases. We have this really famous saying internally, which Michael actually was hosting a panel discussion, and I happened to be on the panel. So Michael, this will be a repetition for you. But internally, when we try to decide as to what to launch for the customer and what our customer is asking for and what should go next on the product roadmap, the famous quote we have is, "In God we trust, everyone else must bring data." Because we want to be a very data-driven retailer, and we try to leverage insights in terms of what the customer is asking for and what we should be catering next to the customer.
Sure. Great saying.
Shashank, you have spent time talking about lean organizations. Now, I've heard of lean startups, but when you talk about a company the size of Kroger, which is, just behind Walmart, what in the world does lean mean?
So the lean startup is a really interesting concept, right? And there are multiple people in corporations, especially big companies, that you'll see they've read the book The Lean Startup, but they're always confused in terms of how do you apply it. Now, I've been fortunate, I've spoken about this in multiple other forums. The fundamental difference here is when a startup goes to market with a product, the customer doesn't know much about the brand of the startup, so the expectations are very different from when a big company that has a well-known brand goes to market with a product. From a big company, the expectations are different, right? Because the brand promise says something. Whenever I go to Starbucks, I explain, actually, you know what, I should take a step back. Even if you look at every big company was small at one point when it started. So essentially, every big corporation was a startup at some point. Now, that point could have been 100 years ago, but it was a startup. And for this small company, which was once a startup, which today we say is a Fortune 50, Fortune 100 company, the way it became big was it put in repeatable, executable processes that scale. Now, closing the circle full round is these repeatable, executable processes are very counterintuitive to innovation. Because think about it, right? At Starbucks, for example, I go to Starbucks every morning. I want my coffee a certain way. I don't want the barista trying to go ahead and experiment with my coffee saying, I was really innovative in how I made your coffee today. It's like, I don't want you to try innovation with my coffee. Just give me my coffee. I come to Starbucks every day, every morning for a particular reason because you are very consistent. When I go to Chipotle, I want my burrito a certain way. Very, very consistent. No matter which Chipotle I go to throughout the country, my burrito tastes exactly the same. So that is the expectation that people have from big companies. Now, the second thing is the brand promise around big companies. When a person chooses to buy a brand, what you really need to understand from a customer mindset is they are opting for security over the unknown. There may be a product offering on the same shelf right next to your preferred brand for half the price. But when you are willing to pay the price premium, what you're opting for is security. You're trying to mitigate the risk of the unknown. So if you're trying to experiment with your core brand, that may or may not be productive. I mean, if it works, then great. But if it doesn't, you've lost a valuable customer. So how you innovate, where you choose to innovate, and where you choose to experiment become really, really critical factors when you talk about big companies. Now, the other thing what I was talking about is in terms of internal processes in big companies, to create that culture around innovation and brainstorming, it has to be done in a very controlled environment, right? You can run experiments, but you need to go ahead and run experiments in a controlled fashion. And I actually just got done reading the book, How Google Works. And they talk about a lot of tech innovation in that. Eric Schmidt and John Rosenberg wrote that book, and I would recommend that. It's a great read. And what they talk about is how the core products built the revenue base for Google to then go ahead and experiment and innovate elsewhere. Of course, they do experiments on the core products too, so like tweaking the search algorithms and AdWords and all of these were at one point an experiment, which actually became successful. But how do you run controlled experiments, set a hypothesis, track and monitor results, and then go ahead and roll it out mainstream? The art lies in that piece and mastering that process, which is very different from going ahead and experimenting with your core brand values.
Would you consider a hackathon a controlled experiment?
Yeah, actually, we support that a lot. So locally in Cincinnati, we are involved in the hackathon community. Internally, we have hackathons too. Those are great ways to go ahead and prototype ideas and see how it works. Now, the other thing about hackathons is companies need to set up an environment where every single day the whole team works like they're working on a hackathon. And the great companies, the ones who really, really differentiate and have built great digital transformative businesses, are the ones who operate in that way on a daily basis.
And what is that specifically? Just before we move to another question, when you say everyday work like it's a hackathon, do you mean sense of urgency, high degree of collaboration, gamified, competitive nature? I mean, what are the elements that you think should come into play on a daily basis?
All of the above plus a little. Because here's the thing, right? When no one wakes up in the morning and comes to work saying, I'm really going to suck today, or I'm really going to screw this up today.
I've had days like that. No, I'm kidding.
No, but everyone wakes up and comes to work saying, I'm going to try to do a great job today. And a lot of times, misaligned goals, misaligned interests, conflicting priorities prevent people from doing a great job. And it becomes very, very critical within big companies to set up an environment where a lot of those are hashed out at a senior leadership level, and the team is not impacted by two senior leaders having misaligned priorities. So that becomes really, really critical to create that environment, because I see the saying on LinkedIn on my feed often, right, where culture eats culture eats strategy for breakfast. And that's actually true. As much as I hate quoting a cliche, it's actually pretty true, right? So how do you create that culture where it's safe to fail and safe to innovate and experiment, at the same time not going ahead and screwing up the brand experience for the customer? And that is a very, very hard dynamic to manage, because that's a very fine line that you're walking on. And that's what we have to do daily, on a daily basis.
And how do you manage that? Because especially in grocery retailing, where the margins are razor thin, and that means that the culture of the organization is oriented around predictability, stability, and consistency. And yet, at the same time, you're involved with the digital future of the company. And so that means that you need to adopt a culture of change and doing things right. Innovation, the foundation, the fundamentals of innovation are all about change. And so how do you manage the tension between the stability of traditional grocery retailing and the need to shift and make changes based on data and these macroeconomic trends and so forth?
What becomes really critical is to identify areas where you can experiment versus areas where you don't run experiments on. So, for example, systems handling money or healthcare data are probably not going to be your first movers in terms of where you run experiments. Of course, we're not going to try to put out an agile release on point of sale where we are just trying to pilot out something, right? Code that goes into production on that front has to be hardened, safe, secure. Same thing in the banking environment. Anything that manages your real-time account balances or your transaction processing systems, they're the ones that really need to be managed with a lot of diligence. On the other hand, there are other systems and other areas where on the front end, for example, application front end, not touching the back end experience, can you go ahead and innovate on that front? Absolutely. In fact, most innovations, again, fall in that category that I mentioned earlier in terms of evolutionary innovations. So how do you go ahead and iterate quickly on top of that while not going ahead and touching the back-end processes? And that dynamic, again, becomes product planning is very, very critical in there.
Shashank, we have startup CEOs and founders that have been guests and watched the show. One, do you work with startups? And two, if you do, what advice do you have to a CEO or a founder of a startup when they're trying to come pitch to you their innovation, their solution, so that they can be more successful?
We actually do work with startups, especially locally. We are very involved in the innovation community. We are part of Centrifuge. We work with the Brandery pretty closely. I personally am a mentor at the Brandery. So we go ahead and talk to startups very often. The key thing that startups need to realize is scale and think about scale, because no matter how much you've tested your system, if we start working with you in terms of just our sheer scale and volume, there'll be issues, right? We've again acquired this company called U Technologies, which does digital coupons out in Silicon Valley. The number one issue we had during the whole integration process was scale, because once we open the floodgates and start redirecting traffic to your systems, it's going to be a really, really hard dynamic for you to keep up in terms of 100x or 200x of volumes that you're traditionally used to. So you need to start thinking scale and think big. Again, coming back to the book that I just completed, right, is how Google works. And the number one thing they discuss about and things that Larry Page and Sergey Brin were very, very keen on initially was think big. You need to think big in order to make it happen. And this is where I think startups and big corporations have the disconnect, where startups need to start thinking a lot bigger in terms of size, scale, volume, and impact if they want to start running a pilot with a larger corporation.
But it's also very difficult for a startup, because in order to have that infrastructure, in order to have the technical infrastructure, you also have to have the right people and competencies and the processes in place, because it's not just about the technology infrastructure, but it's how they work with the larger organization. Having an easy user interface from an organizational standpoint. And that's hard for a startup.
It is, and that's a very tough dynamic to manage, but which is also why if you see startups running experiments with big companies, we've seen occasional successes, but no one's figured out a template or a model around that as to here's the checklist of 10 things you do, and if you follow these 10 things, you'll find a success story. I mean, there is none. So it becomes really, really hard in terms of dynamic and managing that. Good product planning is a key towards helping solve that dynamic, because you need to start thinking and running A/B tests, right? So you cannot just go ahead and redirect all your load to a startup, because of course they're going to fail. You're setting them up for failure. But how do you run good A/B tests and start marginally increasing your load and capacity over? That actually helps out a lot in the long run. But you're absolutely right in your point where managing that dynamic is really, really tricky.
Can you give us a sense of the relationship between technology and customer engagement? I mean, I'm reading a lot. We're reading a lot about Internet of Things and beacons, and you mentioned at the beginning of the show wearables. It seems like contextual intelligence delivered both to the consumer and the business allows for more precision sales and marketing models to exist. And again, targeted value to the right person, right time, right channel, right value. But tie this technology and engagement together so our audience can get a better sense of appreciation of how it's evolving in retail.
So a lot of the innovations that you're starting to see right now, right? Pure tech innovations that are taking off today is a very small subset of innovations that sit on top of the core layer. And the reason I say that, right? So actually, I should take a step back. If you see the history of Silicon Valley, which is the mecca of tech innovation and startups, and it's been that way for 3 or 4 decades now. And if you see why that took off, someone built silicon chips, then they built the microprocessor. Building on the microprocessor, someone took that and built a personal computer. Someone took the personal computer and then went ahead and started building networking infrastructure to connect personal computers. Someone took that and then went ahead and connected all that to build the internet. Someone took the internet to optimize data search on the internet to start creating a more connected environment. So all these innovations layered on top of each other, which created this whole ecosystem. So today when I talk about the explosion of data, there were multiple steps that happened working towards this. If you see the key foundation platforms that were built, right? And again, 2 of my favorite heroes, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. If you see a lot of the work that they have done, their innovative ideas were not, I'm going to launch an app on the App Store that does this, and the customer, I'll get 10,000 downloads, and I'm going to monetize it in this way. They did the real hard work of building platforms and frameworks and operating systems, not just an app that runs on something. Today, we see a lot of startups not doing that hard work of building an ecosystem or an operating system. The ones that do, the payoffs are huge, right? So the examples we discussed earlier, Uber, Airbnb, if you're building an ecosystem around something, you're going to see the payoff. But a lot of startups are just, hey, I'm going to let you analyze marketing insights or data mining. I cannot tell you how many invites I get a day for cold calls, actually, in terms of, I'm going to allow you to do marketing analytics. Well, how many products do I need in the market today to do marketing analytics? So people really need to start tackling the hard problems, kind of things that Steve Jobs and Bill Gates took on as challenges, simplifying the user interface, building something that 100 million, a billion people around the world are going to use. So again, to talk about thinking big, the hard work, that's where the real payoffs are, not necessarily writing an app on the App Store that people download as a fad and then that changes. In fact, if you see the App Store, the top 10 list of apps on there, do you see how often that circulates? Sure. I mean, it's very, very rare to see the same app on the top 10 for weeks and weeks or even months at end. I mean, it rarely ever happens. Now, the ones that actually do are the ones that emerge as truly successful businesses, for example, Facebook. So someone needs to write platforms. So they need to start closing the thinking between what's truly transformative, for example, the Apple Watch, versus what's just a fad that's going to be an app that lets you do something on the watch, right? Slap a cat and it's going to make a funny sound. So,
oh, Michael, your startup idea just got crushed.
I know. It always happens this way. But it's pretty interesting what you're saying. Val, you and I are going to talk later.
That's all right.
But Shashank, it's interesting what you're saying about this, because it also goes to the previous point that we were discussing, that for a startup to be appealing to the enterprise, it's not just about having a piece of technology or even having a product, but it's rather understanding how your product and as a startup and your processes fit easily with the large, well-established, bigger company. Because if you can't fit easily into their process, then they're not going to buy from you.
True. Now, again, here's the other thing, right? When we look to partner, most big companies are generally very, very strategic. Again, I'm just very generic here, but they need to identify the strategic value prop as to what are they going to get out of the startup. Is it the technology? Is it the people? Is it the ability to build something quick that internally would have taken a much longer time to build? Is it so identifying the value prop and the reason for partnering becomes really, really critical. And then you can get into the whole other constraint around how do you share data? What are the security terms? Is the startup going to be able to host my data securely? So these are constraints that always come up in between. And yes, as you said, the startup needs to be more mindful, not necessarily adopt the processes and practices of the big company, because then that's just going to make them a part or a department of the big company, which is then going to slow them down drastically. So I wouldn't say that they need to adopt the process and practices, but they need to start understanding around what are the things that are going to help me be successful in the long run. Because again, a data breach, whether you're a startup or a big company, it's not going to help you either ways, right? So data security and how you manage that, how do you integrate with APIs to then go ahead and manage data. So those kind of things are really, really helpful. So if you're a startup and you have no clue how to secure an API, the odds are you're not going to go too far.
So Shashank, final question for me. You're driving digital business transformation at Kroger. Do you work more with the CIO or the CMO, or is it equal partnership?
It is a pretty integrated experience. So we have a head of digital and e-commerce who's one of the 11 senior officers of the company. So we work closely with him, with the CIO, with the head of marketing, so it's we have an executive team which is pretty tightly aligned and close.
Oh, excellent.
Well, wonderful. This has been an interesting and insightful conversation about the way retail is changing, kind of an inside view, Vala, of what's driving the change and how retailers going about responding to this new environment.
It's incredibly important insight from Shashank, and I think ultimately it's, as I said, you're a digital business or you're a dead business. So hopefully, our audience, including folks that are running IT, marketing, and other important lines of business, can learn from our show today. And Michael, I apologize. I think the Slap the Cat app is actually a pretty cool idea you had.
I was thinking about a pet rock app, actually. What do you think? Shashank, if I made a pet rock app, would you guys buy my company?
Yeah.
I would have a few thoughts about my friendship with you for sure.
Well said. So you have been watching episode number 105 of CXO Talk. I'm Michael Krigsman with my gloriously brilliant co-host Vala Afshar and our gloriously brilliant guest Shashank Saxena, who is responsible for e-commerce, digital and e-commerce technology at Kroger. Shashank, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us today.
Thanks for having me on the show. This has been a great experience. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Great show.
And next week, we are going to be joined by Brian Sivek, who is the Chief Technology Officer for, drum roll, the Department of Health and Human Services. And he'll be our guest next time.
Terrific.
Vala, I hope you have an excellent week.
You as well. Thank you, Michael. Great show.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.